On Christmas Eve, while everyone is sleeping peacefully, there is something creeping through the shadows. He enters through the chimney, his bony hands covered in soot, scratching at the walls. His beard is covered in dried blood, and his eyes are just black holes. They say if you don't leave an offering, he doesn't bring gifts, he takes souls. The good old man you know, maybe he's not that good. There are forgotten legends that speak of a winter visitor, a figure who punishes, devours, and drags away souls, and who completely changes the true spirit of Christmas. Are you ready to discover the dark and deadly side of Christmas? Since I was a child, I heard my grandparents tell stories about the real Saint Nicholas. It was not the good old man who leaves gifts under the tree, but a bishop who walked through the villages carrying a book of sins. He rewarded the good, but punished the bad in ways so horrible that parents used his story to keep us in line. Of course, at the time, I thought they were just stories to scare children, until that Christmas night. I was 12 years old. At that time, we lived in an old house inherited from my great-grandparents in the countryside of Hungary. There was something strange about the house. Corridors that were too long, doors that creaked for no reason, and a cold that persisted even with the fireplace lit. My grandmother always told me to never leave my dirty shoes near the chimney on Christmas Eve. Saint Nicholas hates dirt, he will get you, she warned. I laughed, finding it ridiculous. That night, I decided to challenge the legend. I took my dirtiest boots, still covered in frozen mud, and left them right under the chimney, in the middle of the dark room. My parents were already asleep, and the silence in the house was heavy. I went to sleep, satisfied with the mischief. But I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was like the echo of slow, shuffling footsteps coming from the roof. It's the wind, I tried to convince myself, but the sound soon came from inside the house. Someone was coming down the wooden stairs, a stomp of heavy boots, the firm touch of a staff hitting the floor. I held my breath when I heard the bells. They were not the merry bells of Christmas. They were dull, somber bells, playing a rhythm that seemed like a funeral march. Then something moved at the end of the hall. The dim light of the moon illuminated a tall shadow standing there, a figure, covered in dark red cassocks, worn and stained. He wore a pointed hat, like the ancient bishops, and in his hand was a black book. When he looked up, I saw the white beard, but it wasn't Santa fluffy beard. It was grimy and dirty, as if it had dragged its face through soot. His eyes were two black slits, and when he smiled, his teeth were sharp, yellowish, and very real. I froze as he opened the book and slowly turned the pages. It was as if his every movement sucked the air out of the room. Then he stopped. His bony finger touched a page, and his voice broke the silence. Dirty feet. Rebel heart. No respect for tradition. My throat caught. He knew. He knew about the dirty boots. He knew I defied the legend. Without moving, I tried to convince myself it was a nightmare, but the sound of him approaching made it all too real. The floor creaked beneath his boots. Each step was accompanied by a muffled sound of heavy breathing, like someone who shouldn't be alive. It's time to learn your lesson. He raised his staff and pointed it at me. The shadows in the room began to twist, as if they were alive. They advanced along the walls and ceiling, crawling towards me. When the shadow finally enveloped me, I felt an intense cold, as if my body was being dragged to a dark and endless place. I woke up the next morning, lying on the living room floor, with my dirty boots burned to the soles. My mother thought I had dreamed, but the smell of soot and ash lingered in the house for weeks. Since that day, I have never doubted what the ancients said. Today, every Christmas Eve, I place my cleanest shoes by the fireplace, and I make a point of leaving a glass of milk and black bread, an ancient offering to St. Nicholas, because I know he still walks around with a red cassock and book in his hands, looking for those who defy the rules of Christmas. And have you checked your shoes today? After what happened that Christmas Eve, I was never able to sleep properly in December. Every distant bell, every gust of wind that hit the window brought me back to that night, the sound of heavy boots, muffled breathing, and that black book. I had survived Nicholas' visit, but I knew it wasn't over. It was as if I had been marked. My grandparents used to say that in winter, the veil between the living and the dead is thinner. They talked about the wild hunt, an ancient phenomenon in which wandering spirits, led by shadowy figures, crossed the heavens in search of lost souls. The description of the leader of the wild hunt gave me chills, a tall man with a white beard and shabby clothes, riding a winged creature. Odin, Saint Nicholas, or maybe something more. That year, on December 24th, an abnormal silence took over the house. It seemed like even the wind had stopped. My parents were in the kitchen preparing dinner, and I, without the courage to approach the room where I had seen him, decided to look out my bedroom window. Outside, the sky was dark, but I could see something motion. Small shadows crossed the moonlight like distorted silhouettes. At first, I thought they were birds, but I soon saw what they were: flying horses. Or at least something that looked like horses, but with twisted bodies and glowing red eyes. The sound of dull bells echoed in the sky, accompanied by a low, drawn-out chorus, as if many voices were whispering together. That's when I saw him. A huge figure led the pack, holding a silver staff that gleamed under the moon. His white beard was flowing, but his clothes were stained rags, just like in my previous vision. I wanted to move away from the window, but I was paralyzed. The man slowly turned his head towards me, as if he could see me through the glass. He raised his bony hand and pointed his staff at me, and in that instant, the sky grew darker, as if something was approaching the house. A sound of heavy footsteps echoed on the roof, followed by a scratching in the chimney. "They're coming to get you," I heard a voice whisper, coming from nowhere. Desperate, I ran into the living room. My clean boots were in exactly the same place I had left them, but now they were facing down an ancient sign that the spirits had passed that way. My grandmother used to say that if the boots were turned over, it meant someone would be taken. "They are here. They're here." I screamed, but my parents didn't seem to hear. They were still in the kitchen, laughing as if nothing was happening. It was then that the door to the room began to open on its own. An icy wind entered the house, extinguishing all the candles and leaving only the glow of the fire in the fireplace. The smell of soot returned, heavy and suffocating. My vision blurred, but I could see a shadow standing in the doorway. It was him, but bigger this time, as if he had absorbed the darkness around him. His face was still covered by his white beard, but now his eyes were visible, two empty, black holes that seemed to suck all the light from the room. "You were warned," he murmured in a deep, hoarse voice. Before I could do anything, I felt something grab me by the ankles. I looked down and saw hands coming out of the ground, thin, bony hands trying to pull me into the shadows. I screamed, kicking and struggling, but their strength was unbearable. The leader of the wild hunt always seeks out those who defy tradition, the voice in my head whispered. At the last moment, my mother appeared in the room. She saw me lying on the floor, shaking and clutching my boots. The hands disappeared and the wind ceased. When I looked back at the door, he was gone. The room was dark and cold, and the only sound left was the crackle of the fireplace. The next morning, I found a small silver bell on the living room floor. It was old, stained with rust, and made a low, mournful sound when touched. My grandmother took the bell and pale whispered, "The wild hunt was here. You were lucky." After that Christmas, I never doubted. The old stories again. Saint Nicholas, Odin, the leader of the hunt. Call it what you want. They're still out there, traveling the skies on winter nights, searching for those who don't respect the spirit of Christmas. So if you hear faint bells or footsteps on the roof on Christmas Eve, remember, close your doors tightly, leave an offering to the good old man, and above all, don't look out the window. After that night, I saw the wild hunt. I vowed that I would never again be attracted by what I didn't understand. I spent years trying to forget the shadows in the sky, the muffled bells, and the empty eyes of that figure in the doorway. My family never believed what I said, and over time, I learned to keep it to myself. Until that last Christmas. The Christmas when I discovered what happens when you defy the good old man. It all started on December 23rd, when my aunt invited me to spend the holiday at her old house, isolated in a forgotten village in the countryside. She had lived alone since her husband disappeared years ago, and said Christmas Eve always brought us strange presents. She had the bizarre habit of leaving a plate full of raw meat near the chimney, something she said was an ancient custom for feeding visitors. If he doesn't eat, he'll come get it, was all she said to me with glassy eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was old and creaked with every gust of wind. The fireplace was still burning, casting warped shadows on the walls. From my room, I could hear the lonely bell again, the same faint, distant sound from the wild hunt. My heart raced, but I forced myself to believe it was just the wind. Except it wasn't. At a.m., a deep sound echoed through the house. It was like the sound of something heavy falling onto the roof, followed by a slow drag. I felt my body freeze as the sound stopped directly above the chimney. A deadly silence took over the place. The only thing that could be heard was the faint crackle of dying embers in the fire. It was then that I heard the scraping of nails on the chimney wall, as if something was descending slowly and methodically. Seconds later, a dull thud came from the room. Someone or something had fallen into the fireplace. I could barely breathe. Curiosity got the best of me, and I left the room, going down the stairs with my bare feet, avoiding the creaky steps. From the living room door, I could see him. It wasn't the Saint Nicholas who appears on Christmas cards. It was not a distant spirit in the heavens. That thing was there, alive. The creature was huge. His white beard trailed across the floor like cobwebs, stained with soot and blood. His red clothes were just rags, stuck to a bloated body, as if it were rotten and full of spoiled flesh. The scariest thing was his hands, long, thin fingers with sharp black nails that scraped the wooden floor as he moved. In front of the fireplace, the plate of raw meat was untouched. The creature turned its head slowly, lifeless eyes boring into me. His smile revealed a row of pointed teeth, as sharp as a wolf's. He opened his mouth, and a hoarse sound escaped, like the echo of many voices. "I am hungry." Before I could move, he took a step forward. The floor shook, and I felt the sickening smell of rot fill the room. I hid behind the couch, my heart beating so loud I thought he could hear it. Then I saw something even worse. All around the dead Christmas tree, which my aunt hadn't decorated in years, there were bloody footprints that hadn't been there before. One by one, the ornaments on the tree began to sway on their own, making sounds similar to whispering voices. The lights in the room flickered, and I heard what sounded like whispers coming from the shadows. You didn't leave the offering. Now he's going to eat." The monster turned towards the chimney, where the roof seemed to open up like a black throat. He let out a deafening roar, and I saw something crawling from above. More hands, thin and skeletal, reaching out of the void to grab him. But he resisted, dragging himself out with a grotesque effort as his eyes returned to me. "Next time, I won't leave with anything," he whispered with a horrible smile before disappearing into the darkness of the chimney. I lay there, paralyzed, until my aunt found me in the morning, curled up on the floor, holding a small piece of red cloth, dirty with soot and blood. "You saw him, didn't you?" asked my aunt with sadness in her eyes. "Now you know that it's not just a story." Since then, every Christmas Eve, I leave an offering next to my fireplace: raw meat, brown bread, and a glass of milk. Not out of respect for the good old man, but out of fear, because I know what happens when he gets hungry. And you? Have you looked at your fireplace today? After that night, when a hungry Santa tried to take me, I began to obsessively study the origins of Christmas traditions. Something told me he wasn't the only one. There were more creatures. Hidden under the cloak of legend, other entities that appeared on winter nights. I started delving into my aunt's old books, which seemed almost forbidden. Yellowed pages described primitive versions of the good old man, figures much more shadows than light. The scary thing was that they didn't work alone. Saint Nicholas, the distorted figure who almost took me, had companions, entities as old as him. In Germany, they said that Belznickel was a hooded man, dressed in dark clothes, covered in animal skins. He carried a whip and a sack full of rotten nuts and coal. During Christmas, he visited homes to punish bad children. The reports were clear. He whipped until blood flowed and left black marks as a warning. That year, after the monster visited my house, I began to hear chains dragging during the night. The windows creaked, and dark stains began to appear on the floor, like burned footprints. One day, I found something in my room, a piece of rotten walnut next to a whip mark on the wall. I didn't have the courage to tell anyone. It was then that I understood. Belznickel had come back to mark me. It was as if he knew I had survived the first visitor. And that was unacceptable. The following pages talked about Krampus, a figure as frightening as St. Nicholas' description, but even more brutal. Krampus was a demonic beast with long horns, scaly skin, and red eyes. He came with chains and bells, dragging a sack where he carried evil children to the depths of hell. I started dreaming about him every night. In my dreams, I heard bells, but not the soft Christmas bells. They were deep, macabro bells, accompanied by guttural laughter. One of these nights, I woke up to the sound of chains coming from the end of the hallway. My door started to open on its own, creaking slowly. In the pitch black, two red lights stared at me. A low growl filled the silence, and I saw the shadow of huge horns cast on the wall. I couldn't move. It was only when the first heavy step sounded that I threw myself out of bed, slamming the door shut. I sat in the corner, shaking until dawn. When light finally came through the window, I found claw marks on the wood of the door. My search took me to Italy, where I heard about La Befana, the old witch who flew around on her broomstick, delivering gifts or punishments. Contrary to the happy stories, some accounts said that she not only delivered gifts, but also curses. If anyone was disrespectful or did not leave an offering, she would curse him with a future of misery and death. On January 6th, a date linked to Befana, my house was strange again. The fireplace, which I had locked, was open, with ashes scattered throughout the room. The air was filled with a sweet but rotten smell, like forgotten fruit mixed with burnt flesh. Next to the Christmas tree, I found a straw doll tied with a red thread. My aunt told me that these dolls were cursed and left by La Befana as a warning. If she comes back, don't open the door. Close your eyes and pray she goes away. The night of the final date, that Christmas Eve, I felt like I was no longer alone. They were all there. Saint Nicholas, Belsnickel, Krampus, and La Befana, all waiting for something. The entire house seemed to breathe, as if it were alive. The fire in the fireplace was exploding into black embers, and the walls creaked as if they were about to collapse. When the clock struck midnight, I heard the voices. They whispered together in a distorted chorus. Your debt needs to be paid. Your debt needs to be paid. The Christmas tree began to sway, its dry branches cracking like bones. On the other side of the room, the chimney door exploded, sending soot flying everywhere. From inside it, hands, horns, and claws came out, all trying to cross at the same time. I saw distorted faces, red eyes, sharp teeth, and demonic smiles. They wanted to take me. With the last of my strength, I picked up the straw doll and threw it into the fire, shouting everything I knew about the ancient traditions, their names, the offerings, the prayers. The voices screamed in agony as the fire consumed the doll. And then, silence. When I woke up, the room was cold and empty. Only the clock kept ticking, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that was a warning. They exist. They are the true visitors of Christmas, the figures that time tried to erase, but who never really disappeared. And if you forget to respect them, they will come, one by one. Now, every Christmas Eve, I leave coal, black bread, and milk next to the fireplace. It's not a superstition. It's a payment. Because I know that, in the darkness of winter, they are still watching after years of running away and trying to understand the dark visitations of Christmas. I realized that these entities, St. Nicholas, Krampus, Belsnickel, and La Befana, were not just stories or legends. They were too old to disappear, ancient entities that time turned into harmless children's tales, but whose true nature still echoes on cold December nights. The modern world, with its bright lights and noisy parties, has forgotten the original covenant of Christmas. Christmas wasn't about gifts and celebrations. It was about respect and offerings to winter visitors, beings who walk among the living and the dead when the nights are longest and the cold cruelest. My grandmother used to say, Christmas is a deal, an exchange. They bring light into our homes, but you need to pay with respect, kindness, and a simple gift for the darkness. I never understood what she meant until that last Christmas Eve. That night, the air was heavier than ever. The fire in the fireplace burned weakly, as if it too was afraid of something. Bells began to ring outside, followed by footsteps, lots of footsteps, like a crowd marching through the snow. The shadows in the hallways grew thicker, as if they had a life of their own, and the smell of soot and burning flesh filled the house. I felt that this would be the last visit. They no longer came to scare me. They were coming to take me. The door to the room opened by itself. Outside, in the snow-covered yard, I saw a procession. They were all there. St. Nicholas, with his red cassocks and open black book, muttering names that echoed like thunder. Krampus, dragging his chains and laughing, his eyes glowing like embers. Belsnickel whipping the air with fury as he slowly walked towards the house. La Befana riding her broom with a basket full of straw. Dolls all turned upside down. They stopped at the entrance of the house and looked at me. St. Nicholas stepped forward, his staff hitting the floor, creating a sound that reverberated throughout the house. You failed in your promise. Forgot the deal. Christmas is a time of giving, and you refused to pay I tried to explain, to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. St. Nicholas held out the black book towards me, and when I looked, I saw my name written in red letters as if it had been marked in blood. The shadows inside the house began to move, crawling across the floor and climbing the walls. I ran to the fireplace and grabbed what I could: a piece of bread, milk, and a handful of old coins that my aunt kept. I placed everything on the floor, at their feet as a last offering. For a moment, silence fell. St. Nicholas closed the book slowly, and Krampus let out a low growl, as if dissatisfied. This time, he will be spared. But never forget the true spirit of Christmas. Then, one by one, they turned and disappeared into the snow, their figures blending into the darkness. All that remained was the sound of bells echoing in the distance. Since that night, I understood what my grandmother meant. Christmas is not just a joyful celebration. It's a ritual, a time to give and respect, not just to the people around us, but also to the shadows watching on the other side. If you hear midnight bells, footsteps on the roof, or voices whispering near the chimney, don't ignore it. Leave a simple gift: brown bread, fresh milk, or an offering of old coins. Because if you forget the agreement, they will come to collect your debt. Christmas is a time of light, yes, but it is the light that keeps the darkness at bay, and darkness is always lurking. So this Christmas, ask yourself, have you been generous enough? Because if you haven't, maybe winter visitors will be knocking on your door, and they don't come to bring gifts for more terrifying stories like this. Subscribe to the channel to follow our work. Until later.